The French and Indian War, spanning from 1754 to 1763, it was the North American theater of the broader conflict known as the 7 Years' War, which ultimately shifted the balance of the power on the continent by establishing British dominance over the French territories. Initiated by disputes over territorial claims in the Ohio Valley, crucial for fur trading with Native American tribes, the war saw France and its Native American allies battling against the British forces and American colonists. Key battles, including the pivotal capture of Quebec, led to a decisive British victory. The war concluded with the 1763 Treaty of Paris, where France ceded extensive North American territories to Britain, including all of Canada and parts of Louisiana east of the Mississippi River. This significant transfer of land not only impacted the Native American tribes, but it also set the stage for the later American Revolutionary War, as Britain's new taxation policies on the American colonies to cover their war debts sparked widespread colonial dissent. Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Now today we're going to cover something a little bit in the early modern period as we get into a little bit more of the American history over the next month or so. Hope you're looking forward to that. As always, the most interesting and insightful comment will be pinned on top for all to see, so do write something relevant, or just something thought-provoking. Now let's get on with it, shall we? Well, we find ourselves first in the mid-18th century, and at this time, North America, east of the Mississippi River, was largely under control of the British or the French, albeit shaky control, but vast regions remained that were unsettled, at least by European colonists. Now the French population, which was around 75,000, was concentrated along the St. Lawrence River, Arcadia, which is now parts of New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, and settlements in Louisiana and the Illinois country. Now at the time, if you were going to go and try to make it out in the New World, you'd probably do what most of the other people who just worked with their hands by the sweat of their brow did. You'd become a fur trapper or trader. And thus many of the French did exactly that. French fur traders and trappers navigated the St. Lawrence and Mississippi rivers, trading with and even marrying into Native American tribes. Of course, this certainly solidified alliances with the indigenous leaders. It also helped to grease the wheels when you give them a couple of guns. They seem to like them. Well, in contrast, the British settlers numbered a little bit more, approximately 1.5 million. Rough mathematics, this outnumbers the French by 20 to 1. And they were spread along the Atlantic coast, from Nova Scotia to Georgia, with settlements gradually expanding inland. Now, although Britain had claimed territories like Nova Scotia and Rupert's Land, many interior regions were still controlled by indigenous tribes. Now, several Native American groups maintained influence between the French and British colonies. In the north, the Mi'kmaq, Abenakis, and other tribes resisted the British encroachment in Nova Scotia and Acadia. The Iroquois Confederation dominated parts of New York and the Ohio country, and they strategically aligned with either the British or the French, depending on what trade advantages they could get It all comes down to convenience. At the end, you get the best deal. Well, in the southeast, there were tribes like the Catawbs, the Creeks, the Choctaws, and Cherokees who resided more in the interior areas. Of course, the situation with all of these tribes is incredibly complex. Quite hard to explain where the territories begin and end. Perhaps visual aids would be more useful in this regard. But we're not going to go too deeply into that. And in general, I will use the blanket term Native Americans, even though from my understanding, many natives in the United States prefer to be referred to as their tribal classification rather than just that broad umbrella term before someone makes the comment. Now, during this war, the French used their trade networks to recruit warriors from tribes in the western Great Lakes. Now, that includes from the Hurons, the Ojibwas, and Potawatomi. The British colonists initially received support from the Iroquois Six Nations and the Cherokees. The relations with the Cherokee deteriorated, leading to the Anglo-Cherokee War in 1758. Can't deteriorate much more than that now, can't you? Well, in the same year, the province of Pennsylvania successfully negotiated the Treaty of Easton, securing neutrality from several Ohio County tribes in exchange for land concessions. Most northern tribes aligned with the French, their primary trade partner and supplier of weapons, and indeed many of the native tribes were using guns. Now, diplomatic efforts were also made by the French and the British to secure the allegiance or neutrality of the Creek tribe and the Cherokee tribe. But of course, the world is not just Britain and France. Spain at this time also controlled Florida and Cuba, as well as other West Indies territories, making them also military targets during the 7 Years' War. Florida's European population was admittedly small, and this small population was mainly concentrated in the settlement of St. Augustine. Now, at the start of the war, New France did not have French regular army troops in America, and they relied instead on around 3,000 Marines and colonial regulars who were experienced in forest warfare. Certainly comes in handy in the New World. And the French colonial administration also recruited militia when needed. The British had a few regular troops, with most colonies relying on local militias as well, but these were poorly trained, and they could only really rely on them for short periods. Virginia, however, was a different story. You see, they had numerous companies of trained and geared up British regulars due to its large frontier. Now, the British colonial governments operated independently from each other, and the central British government in London, which complicated negotiations with Indian tribes whose lands overlapped with multiple colonial claims. As the conflict progressed, British army leaders imposed greater restrictions and demands on the colonies. Governor General Roland Michel Barin de la Galissonière of New France grew concerned about the increasing presence of the British traders like George Croghan in the Ohio country. In June 1747, he ordered Pierre-Joseph Céloron to lead a military expedition into the region with specific objectives: to reaffirm New France's indigenous allies that their trading agreements with colonists were exclusive to those sanctioned by New France, to validate indigenous support in asserting and upholding the French claim to the territories claimed by the French explorers, to deter any alliances between Britain and the local indigenous tribes, to impress the indigenous people with a display of French military strength against the British, colonial settler encroachment, unauthorized trading ventures, and general violation of the French claims. Now, Céloron's expedition comprised nearly 200 troops, Marines mainly, along with 30 indigenous individuals for backup, and they traversed nearly 3,000 miles from June to November of 1749. They ascended the St. Lawrence, proceeding along the northern shoreline of Lake Ontario, traversed the portage at Niagara, and adhered to the southern shoreline of Lake Erie. The expedition advanced inland from the Chautauqua portage in Barcelona, New York, tracing the Allegheny River to the location of Pittsburgh. Now, Céloron interred lead plates inscribed with the French assertion of sovereignty over the Ohio country. Upon encountering British colonial merchants or fur traders, he notified them of the French claims to the land and instructed them to basically get the hell out. Well, Céloron's expedition reached Logstown, where local indigenous people asserted their ownership of the Ohio country and indicated their willingness to trade with British colonists, irrespective of what the French thought about it. You can imagine the French were not too pleased with this. Well, after this, Céloron proceeded south until his expedition arrived at the junction of the Ohio and Miami rivers, located just south of the settlement of Pickawillany, the residence of the Miami chief, referred to as Old Britain. Now, Céloron admonished Old Britain with dire repercussions should he persist in trading with British colonists. Although Old Britain disregarded the caution, Céloron returned to Montreal with disappointment in November of 1749. He wrote a meticulously detailed report, and from it he wrote, "I can only state that the indigenous populations of these regions have a significant animosity towards the French and are wholly loyal to the English. I am uncertain regarding the method of their potential restoration." While prior to his return to Montreal, news of the situation in the Ohio country was reaching London and Paris, with both sides advocating for intervention. Governor William Shirley of Massachusetts asserted empathetically that British colonists would remain unsafe as the French remained in the vicinity. The War of Austrian Succession at this time concluded in 1748 with the signing of the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, which principally addressed the European issues back home. The competing territory claims between the British and French colonies were submitted to a commission, which unfortunately rendered no conclusion. You see, both parties asserted claims over frontier territories, extending from Nova Scotia and Acadia in the north to the Ohio country in the south. The conflicts also stretched into the Atlantic Ocean, where both nations sought access to the abundant fisheries of the Grand Banks near Newfoundland. In 1749, the British Crown granted land in the Ohio country to the Ohio Company of Virginia for trade and colonization, requiring the settlement of 100 families and the construction of a fort. Pennsylvania, also claiming the region, sought to strengthen its own claims. In 1750, the following year, Christopher Gist explored the area on behalf of Virginia and the Ohio Company, negotiating with indigenous leaders at Logstown. The resulting 1752 Treaty of Logstown, agreed upon by the indigenous half-king, as they called him, Tanacharison, and an Iroquois representative, allowed the British to build a fortified dwelling at the confluence of the Monongahela River in present-day Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Following the death of Governor General of New France, Marquis de la Jonquière, in 1752, Charles Le Moyen de Longueuil took over temporarily, while Marquis Duquesne arrived later that year as the new governor. The growing British presence in the Ohio country prompted Longueuil to send Charles Michel de Langley, leading 300 French Canadians and Ottawa warriors, to punish the Miami tribe at Pickawillany for trading with the British. The June 1752 attack resulted in 14 deaths on the Miami side and the capture of 3 British traders. In 1753, Paul Marin de la Marche led a 2,000-man French expedition to secure French claims in the Ohio Valley, constructing Fort Presque Isle near the present-day Erie, Pennsylvania, and Fort Le Boeuf to protect French interests. This worried both the British and the Iroquois, especially the half-king, as they called him, Tanacharison, who held a deep grudge against the French. He visited Fort Le Boeuf, threatening military action, but Marin dismissed him. In response to growing tensions, the Iroquois sent messengers to William Johnson, the British superintendent for Indian affairs, known to the Iroquois as Waragigi. Johnson, well versed in their languages, had long-standing ties with the Iroquois people, and had even served as a colonel in the Western New York militia. It's quite a resume, isn't it? You imagine back then having to learn those sorts of languages. It was hard enough for me in the 2020s to learn Mandarin. I can only imagine what it was like back then. Well, the Indian delegates and Ann Johnson convened with Governor George Clinton and authorities from several other American colonies in Albany, New York. Now, the Mohawk chief Hendrick served as the spokesperson for the tribal council, insisting that the British fulfill their commitments and impede the French expansion. But Clinton did not answer enough, and Hendrick stated that the Covenant chain, a long-standing amicable relationship between the Iroquois Confederacy and the British Crown, had been well and truly severed. Now, Governor Robert Dinwiddie, which is a very interesting name, of Virginia, was a stakeholder in the Ohio Company, which faced financial losses if the French maintained their territorial claim. He instructed the 21-year-old Major George Washington, whose sibling was also an investor in the Ohio Company, of the Virginia Regiment, to admonish the French to vacate Virginia land in October of 1753. Washington departed with a small entourage, including Jacob Van Braam as an interpreter, Christopher Gist, a corporate surveyor in the region, and other Mingos commanded by Tanacharison. On December the 12th, Washington and his troops arrived at Fort Le Boeuf. Now, Jacques Legardeur de Saint-Pierre succeeded Marin as the commander of the French soldiers following Marin's death on October 29th, and he sent an invitation to Washington to have dinner together. It's very nice of him. Well, during dinner, Washington presented Saint-Pierre with Dinwiddie's letter requesting an immediate French withdrawal from the Ohio country. Of course, this was perhaps not the best dinner conversation. Well, Saint-Pierre reportedly stated, "Regarding the summons you have sent me to retire, I do not believe I am obliged to comply." Somewhat of a polite response. Well, he informed Washington that France's assertion to the territory was more legitimate than that of the British, as René Robert Cavalier, Sieur de la Salle, had visited the Ohio country almost 100 years ago. Try proving him otherwise, I suppose. Well, dessert all finished up, Washington's party departed Fort Le Boeuf on December the 16th and reached Williamsburg on January 16th, 1754, where he reported that the French had advanced south, outlining the measures that they implemented to strengthen the region and their objectives to reinforce the junction of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers. Prior to Washington's return, Dinwiddie dispatched a contingent of 40 soldiers, led by William Trent, to the location where they commenced the construction of a modest stockaded fort in the early months of 1754. Governor Duquesne dispatched supplementary French troops under Claude Pierre Picotti de Contrecoeur to assist Saint-Pierre concurrently. Now, and Contrecoeur, he also commanded 500 soldiers southward from Fort Venango on April 5th, 1754. The soldiers reached the fort on April 16th, some 11 days later, although Contrecoeur graciously permitted Trent's diminutive contingent to retreat. He acquired the construction tools that they had to proceed with the construction of what ultimately became Fort Duquesne. So you can go, but we're taking your things. Well, Dinwiddie had instructed Washington to command a greater contingent to support Trent in his endeavors, and Washington became aware of Trent's withdrawal while he was en route. Mingo, Sachem, Tangrisson had pledged assistance to the British, prompting Washington to proceed to Fort Duquesne to confer with him. Subsequently, he was informed by a warrior dispatched by Tannegrisson about a French scouting group in the vicinity, prompting him to include Tannegrisson's 12 Mingo warriors into his contingent. Washington's contingent of 52 ambushed 40 Canadians, those French colonists of New France, on the morning of May 28th, an engagement that became known as the Battle of Jumonville Glen. Now, numerous Canadians were slain, including their commanding officer, Joseph Colon de Jumonville, whose skull was allegedly cleaved by Tannegrisson with a tomahawk. Now, it's also said that Tannegrisson sought to get the British backing and re-establish his power over his own people with their help. They were, either way, predisposed to endorse the French, with whom they had established extensive business links. One of Tannegrisson's subordinates informed Contrecoeur that Jumonville had succumbed to British musket fire. But historians typically regard the Battle of Jumonville Glen as the inaugural conflict of the French and Indian War in North America, marking the commencement of hostilities in the Ohio Valley. Well, subsequent to the battle, Washington retreated several miles and constructed Fort Necessity, which was assaulted by the Canadians under the leadership of Jumonville's brother during the Battle of Fort Necessity on the 3rd of July. Washington capitulated and engaged in negotiations for an armed retreat. A report from one of his men indicated that the Canadian contingent was joined by Shawnee, Delaware, and Mingo warriors, precisely those whom Tanagreeson had aimed to sway to his side. Well, reports of the two confrontations arrived in England in August, and following months of discussions, the Duke of Newcastle's government resolved to dispatch a military expedition to the subsequent year to expel the French. Major General Edward Braddock was selected to command the expedition. Information regarding the British military plan was actually disclosed to France prior to Braddock's departure for North America. Well, in 1755, King Louis XV sent 6 troops to New France, led by Baron Dieskau. In February 1755, the British dispatched their own fleet with the objective of blockading the French ports. However, the French navy weren't even there. They'd already left, and there's no point in blockading them in if they're not actually in the port. Kind of defeats the purpose, doesn't it? Well, Admiral Edward Hawke dispatched a rapid squadron to North America to intercept the ships. Well, a subsequent British operation, Admiral Edward Boscawen engaged the French vessel Alcide on June 8, 1755, and seized her along with 2 troop ships. Chalk one up to the British. The British subjected the French shipping to harassment in 1755, confiscating vessels and apprehending sailors wherever they could. These actions finally led to formal declarations of war in the spring of 1756. Now, the Albany Congress, to rewind a little bit for you, was convened in June and July of 1754 as a significant political response to the commencement of the war. Now, the objective of Congress was to establish a cohesive strategy in commerce and talks with the indigenous peoples. Prepare was for what to come. And as the loyalty of the several tribes and nations was so important, well, they really had to get to work. So, the plan endorsed by the delegates was neither adopted by the colonial legislatures nor sanctioned by the Crown, but the structure of the Congress and other details of the plan served as a kind of model for confederation throughout the War of Independence. We'll always get to that one later. Now, back to 1755. The British had devised a belligerent operational strategy in this year. General Braddock was assigned to command the expedition at Fort Duquesne, and Massachusetts Governor William Shirley was tasked with building Fort Oswego and assaulting Fort Niagara. Sir William Johnson was tasked with seizing Fort St. Frederick in Crown Point, New York, while Lieutenant Colonel Robert Monckton was sent to seize the Fort Beauséjour on the east, on the border between Nova Scotia and Arcadia. Now, in June of the year 1755, Braddock commanded approximately 1,500 men and provincial militia during the Braddock expedition to capture Fort Duquesne, with George Washington serving as one of his advisors. The expedition was a failure. French regulars, Canadian militia, and indigenous fighters ambushed them from concealed positions under trees and behind logs, prompting Braddock to order a general retreat. But he was killed, and around 1,000 British men were either wounded or met the same fate. The remaining 500 British troops sadly withdrew back to Virginia, commanded by Washington. Of course, Washington and Thomas Gage were instrumental in orchestrating the retreat. Of course, the two future adversaries in the American Revolutionary War. Now, in response to Braddock's defeat and the beginning of Parliament session in November 1755, the British government launched a series of measures aimed at strengthening its military capabilities. These actions included the Recruiting Act of 1756, the Commissions to Foreign Protestants Act of 1756, and the Naval Prize Act of 1756, which authorized the capture of enemy vessels and permitted privateering after the war was declared on May 17th. Now, just quickly, if you don't know what privateering is, basically, if you're a pirate, you find the ships transporting goods, silver, tea, all the rest, that sort of thing. You board them and you steal it. Now, pirates are criminals, right? Well, if you're really good at it, then the government might employ you to disrupt the trade shipping lines of their adversaries. So let's say, for example, the British are at war with the French, and you're quite a good pirate. They might say, how about you become a privateer for us? You find all of the ships that are carrying all the Spanish goods, basically the backbones of their economy, and you capture them and give them to us instead. It's government-sanctioned piracy, just with a more palatable name. Now, back to the main point. Meanwhile, the French obtained British military plans, including those of Generals Shirley and Johnson. Now, Shirley's efforts to reinforce Oswego were hampered by logistical problems and inexperience. He stationed troops in Oswego, Fort Bull, and Fort Williams to prepare for an assault on Fort Niagara. However, the French began massing forces of their own, getting ready to attack Oswego, which forced Shirley to prioritize a defensive strategy rather than an offensive. Now, Governor Vaudreuil of New France saw Johnson as a great threat and sent Baron Dieskau to confront him at Fort St. Frederick. Dieskau planned to attack Fort Edward, but hesitated due to resistance from his indigenous allies. The two forces eventually did clash in the Battle of Lake George, which ended inconclusively, and both sides withdrew without really gaining anything worth writing home about. Now, Johnson's progress stopped at Fort William Henry, while the French retreated and began constructing Fort Carillon, later renamed to Fort Ticonderoga, after its capture by the British in 1759. In 1759, Colonel Monckton successfully captured Fort Beausejour, cutting off land-based French reinforcements to Louisbourg. Governor Charles Lawrence of Nova Scotia ordered the deportation of the French-speaking Acadians to further weaken Louisbourg, and these deportation efforts significantly contributed to the eventual fall. Now, following the death of Braddock, William Shirley assumed command of the British forces in North America and presented his plan for 1756. His strategy included attacks on Niagara, Crown Point, Duquesne, and Fort Frontenac, as well as an expedition aimed at Quebec. However, conflicts with the other leaders, such as William Johnson and Governor Sir Charles Hardy of New York, hindered the plan. resulting in limited support and progress. In January of 1756, Lord Loudoun replaced Newcastle as the new British commander, with Major General James Abercrombie as his deputy. Now, both of these men lacked the military experience of the French officers sent to North America, such as Major General Louis-Joseph de Montcalm, Chevalier de Levis, and Colonel Francois Charles de Bourlamaque, all of whom were seasoned veterans from the War of the Austrian Succession, which had just finished up, as we had mentioned before, with the treaty signed. Now, in May 1756, French regular troops arrived in New France, and on May 17th, Britain officially declared war, escalating the conflict into Europe and giving rise to the 7 Years' War, the more broader conflict. Well, Governor Vaudreuil, eager to lead the French forces, acted before the arrival of French reinforcements. He identified vulnerabilities in the British supply lines and ordered an attack on forts along the Oneida Carry, leading to the destruction of Fort Bull and its supplies, including 45,000 pounds of gunpowder. Of course, this significantly weakened the British operations on Lake Ontario and endangered the garrison at Oswego. French forces also incited indigenous tribes in the Ohio Valley to raid frontier settlements, sending waves and waves of refugees eastward. While the new British command was slow to act, Abercrombie arrived in Albany by July but hesitated to engage without Loudoun's approval. Meanwhile, Montcalm seized the opportunity to besiege Oswego, while feigning an attack along Lake George. By August, Montcalm successfully captured Oswego, but tensions arose between his forces and their indigenous allies over the distribution of the prisoners' belongings. Loudoun, a capable administrator, but overly cautious in battle, planned an attack on Quebec in 1757, stationing a large force at Fort William Henry to distract Montcalm. However, William Pitt, the Secretary of State, redirected Loudoun's efforts to Louisbourg. Despite the preparations, the British fleet at Halifax were outmatched and outclassed by the larger French force at Louisbourg, forcing Loudoun to retreat to New York after hearing of a massacre at Fort William Henry. French irregulars, including Canadian scouts and indigenous warriors, began besieging Fort William Henry in early 1757. In January, they ambushed British Rangers near Ticonderoga, and in February, raided positions across frozen Lake George, destroying storehouses. By August, Montcalm's force of 7,000 surrounded the fort, which surrendered on the condition that the British withdraw under parole. However, as they retreated, Montcalm's indigenous allies, angered by the loss of plunder, attacked the British, resulting in the death or capture of hundreds of men, women, and even children. The aftermath of the siege may have contributed to the spread of smallpox among the distant indigenous groups. But, well, there's no real concrete evidence to support this. Perhaps it's true, though. Well, in 1758, Vaudreuil and Montcalm received scant resupply due to the British blockade of the French coastline, which restricted French shipping. The circumstances in New France were worsened by a deficient harvest in 1757, a particularly harsh winter, and the purportedly fraudulent schemes of one Francois Bigot, the territory's intendant. His plans to provide the colony resulted in exaggerated pricing that were perceived by Montcalm as a means to enrich himself and his cronies. A significant smallpox outbreak among the Western Indian tribes also caused many to refrain from trading in 1758. Don't want to share blankets, you know what it's like. The disease likely disseminated due to the overcrowded circumstances in Fort William Henry following the fight. However, the indigenous people attributed the affliction to the French, outright accusing them of introducing what they said was bad medicine and depriving them of the spoils at Fort William Henry. Montcalm concentrated his limited resources on the defense of St. Lawrence, establishing key fortifications at Carillon, Quebec, and Louisbourg. But Vaudreuil advocated ineffectively for the persistence of raiding strategies that had been proven successful in prior years. The British setbacks in North America, coupled with more defeats in the European theatre, resulted in the downfall of Newcastle and the Duke of Cumberland, his chief military advisor. Newcastle and Pitt had formed a tenuous coalition, with Pitt exerting control over military strategy. He initiated a strategy for the 1758 campaign that was predominantly formulated by Laudon. He was supplanted by Abercrombie as commander-in-chief following the setbacks of 1757. And you see, Pitt's strategy proposed 3 significant offensive operations with substantial regular soldier contingents, bolstered by provincial militias, with the objective of seizing the core territories of New France. 2 expeditions succeeded, resulting in the capture of Fort Duquesne and Louisbourg by substantial British forces. Now, onto the Forbes expedition, a British military expedition conducted from September to October of 1758, with 6,000 troops under the command of General John Forbes, aimed at expelling the French from the disputed Ohio country. The French retreated from Fort Duquesne, ceding control of the Ohio River Valley, to the British. The formidable French stronghold at Louisbourg in Nova Scotia was also seized following a protracted siege. The third invasion was halted by the unexpected French triumph at the Battle of Carillon, where 3,600 French soldiers overcame Abercrombie's contingent of 18,000. That's embarrassing, isn't it? Mainly made up of regular troops, militia, and Native American allies, near the fort known as Carillon by the French. In 1758, the French saw predominantly unfavorable outcomes in pretty much all of the areas of the war. It just wasn't going well for them. Now, the new foreign minister, Duc de Choiseul, resolved to concentrate on the invasion of Britain and divert British resources from North America and the European mainland. Of course, the invasion was unsuccessful, not just militarily but politically, since Pitt devised substantial campaigns against New France and allocated resources to Britain's continental ally, Prussia, while the French Navy faltered in the 1759 naval engagements at Lagos and Quiberon Bay. In a fortunate turn of events for them, many French shipping supply lines successfully departed from France and evaded the British blockade. Lucky for them. Within this same year, 1759, that the British launched a campaign in the northwest frontier of Canada. to sever the French frontier forts to the west and the south. They seized Ticonderoga and Fort Niagara, and they vanquished the French at the Thousand Islands during the summer of 1759. In September 1759, James Wolfe triumphed against Montcalm in the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, resulting in the fatalities of both commanders. Following the battle, the French surrendered the city to the British. In April of 1760, François Gaston de Levis commanded the French troops in an assault to reclaim Quebec. Despite his victory at the Battle of Sainte-Foy, Levis' next siege of Quebec culminated in failure upon the arrival of the British ships to reinforce the garrison. Following his retreat, he suffered an additional setback when the British naval triumph at Restigouche resulted in the loss of French vessels intended to replenish his forces. Just keeps getting worse for him, doesn't it? Well, in July, Geoffrey Amherst commanded British forces of approximately 18,000 troops in a three-pronged assault on Montreal. Following the eradication of the French fortifications along route, all three troops converged and encircled Montreal in September. A considerable number of Canadians abandoned or relinquished their weapons to British soldiers, while the indigenous allies of the French pursued peace and neutrality. De Levis and the Marquis de Vandrel begrudgingly endorsed the Articles of Capitulation of Montreal on September the 8th, therefore finalizing the British occupation of New France. Well, the majority of hostilities in America concluded in 1760. However, the conflict persisted in Europe between France and Britain. A significant exception was the French capture of St. John's in Newfoundland. General Amherst learned of this unexpected maneuver and promptly sent forces led by his nephew William Amherst, who re-established control over Newfoundland following the Battle of Signal Hill, September 1762. A significant number of British troops stationed in America were actually redeployed to engage in subsequent British operations in the West Indies, including the seizure of Spanish Havana. Following Spain's delayed entry into the conflict alongside France, and also a British expedition against French Martinique in 1762, commanded by Major General Robert Monckton. In September of 1760, Governor Vaudreuil in Montreal negotiated a surrender with General Amherst. Amherst approved his wishes that any French residents opting to remain in the colony would be permitted to practice their Roman Catholic faith, possess property, and reside undisturbed. The British administered medical care to ill and injured French soldiers, and French regular troops were repatriated to France on British vessels under the condition that they would not re-engage in the ongoing conflict. That all sounds pretty fair, don't you think? It's a pretty good deal, surprisingly humane, especially for the time period. Well, General Amherst supervised the handover of French fortifications to the British authority on the western frontier. The policies he implemented in those territories unsettled numerous natives and precipitated the onset of the Pontiac's War in 1763, characterized by a series of native assaults on frontier forts, including an attack on Fort Miami. Well, that effectively concluded a nearly 5-year period of European garrisoning at Kekyonga. The boundary settlements necessitated the ongoing stationing of British troops, and the conflict was not really resolved entirely until as late as 1766. We all know what happened then. Well, from the 1750s to the 1760s, a smallpox epidemic ravaged numerous Native American tribes across the Midwest. The outbreak was partially instigated by victorious native fighters allied with the French, who returned with battle spoils contaminated by disease. You see, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi tribes were the most impacted by the pandemic. Odawa tribe chief and historian Andrew Blackbird reported that the outbreak had, I quote, completely depopulated and devastated Waganigisi, a significant Odawa village. Well, the North American conflict, all part of this global 7 Years' War, concluded with the signing of the Treaty of Paris on the 10th of February 1763 by the kingdoms of Great Britain, France, Spain, and with the concurrence of Portugal. The British presented France with the option to relinquish either its continental North American territories east of the Mississippi or the Caribbean islands of Guadeloupe and Martinique, which had been seized by the British. France opted to relinquish the former territory, but successfully negotiated the retention of Saint-Pierre and Miquelon, two diminutive islands, and the Gulf of St. Lawrence, as well as fishing rights in the vicinity. Well, the economic value of the Caribbean islands' sugar cane was perceived as superior and more defensible than that of the continent's furs. The French philosopher Voltaire derogatorily described Canada as merely a few acres of snow. It's not very nice of him, isn't it? Well, either way, the British were pleased to acquire New France, as the defense of their North American colonies would pretty much no longer be a concern. Well, at least not from the other Europeans. Plenty of frontier wars. Well, however, the elimination of the threat led many colonists to believe that they no longer required British protection, which no doubt led many of them to ask the question, well, what are we paying taxes for? Of course, you know what happens over the next couple of years. We're going to get to it. Well, pretty much Britain's debt nearly doubled from the war, and it prompted efforts to tax the colonies, which led to resistance and eventually a revolution. But in contrast, France valued its sugar-producing colonies more than its North American territories, with figures like Voltaire, of course, downplaying the significance. Who cares about the few acres of snow? Still, the war weakened France too, financially and politically. It wasn't long after that they had their French Revolution in 1789. Well, it's not a good few decades for the ruling classes, isn't it? Well, the removal of French influence in America affected the indigenous tribes, who lost a key ally. The British gained control over Spanish Florida, leading to indigenous migrations and increased tensions, especially between the Choctaw and Creek. Spain's acquisition of Louisiana had pretty much minimal effects, but many Spanish Catholics left Florida for Cuba. In 1778, France returned to America as an ally of the American Revolution, seeking revenge for its earlier losses. Isn't it funny how that works? We don't think of the French being on the colonist side during the Revolution, but they were. Anything to get back at the British, I suppose. Well, with that, we come to the end of that war. There'll be plenty more wars to discuss, won't there? Getting into some American history, since most of my viewers are actually American. I suppose we get around to it eventually. Well, I'm going to thank the top tier supporters, both on YouTube memberships and Patreon. It's Dark, Kerry, Kimberly, Ember, Ben, Britt, Charles, Erin, James, Jeffrey, Melissa, Scott, Stark Factory, Wendy, Jaden, Sherry, Jessica, Christine, Sally, Katiana, and Christine. Thank you very much. And let me know what you want to see next. More American history, or you want me to go all the way back to the Bronze Age. Either way, I'll be doing something. Good night. Lots of love to you all.